Hello, I am Nikki Going and I'm recording this presentation on behalf of Enhanced Language Services or ELS. This presentation is on Fern Hill by Dylan Thomas, an English poet. I hope that you enjoy the presentation and find it useful. Although you will never be examined on historical details or background information on a poet, if you understand the poet in their context, it makes understanding their poetry much easier. Dylan Thomas was born on October the 27th in 1914 in Swansea in Wales. His father taught English and his mother came from a farming background, which explains the setting of Fern Hill and the poet's love of language, the outdoors, and his rural childhood on his aunt's farm. Thomas left school early, at 16, so that he could become a reporter. He was a prolific writer who began his writing career while he was still very young. He was proudly Welsh, which is important because it shaped his poetic voice. Although Dylan Thomas wrote most of his poetry in English, he spoke Welsh and grew up with parents who were completely fluent Welsh speakers. The influence of the musical lilting of the Welsh accent affected his choice of words or diction and the rhythm of his poetry. His poetry is famous for this musical quality, his descriptions of vivid emotions, and his powerful use of imagery. He often explored themes of death, nature, and childhood, as he does throughout Fern Hill. He lived well after the Romantic era, so you cannot say that he is a romantic poet. However, he is sometimes described as a modern romantic poet because he emphasized many of the same themes that the Romantic poets had emphasized. For example, the importance of emotional and imaginative experiences. His poems also explore universal themes such as love and death with a great deal of emotion, and he had an enormous respect for nature that bordered on seeing it as a mystical, almost religious or spiritual force. In Fern Hill, you can see how he described his experiences of nature as a child, as making him feel that he was in the presence of God or something holy, and this is typical of a romantic poet. He also tended to focus on subjective experiences, which he described in rich symbolic language, again typical of romantic poets. Remember that the term subjective means that the way something is understood or described depends entirely on a particular individual's feelings, opinions, or experiences. It is not factual. Subjective descriptions are unashamedly biased, personal, and emotive. And remember that a bias is a tendency towards a particular opinion. So it's very opinionated, very personal. And emotive language is language that expresses strong emotions. So like connotations, subjective descriptions will vary from one person to another, and they're very much influenced by culture and society. And although Thomas was not traditionally religious, he was extremely spiritual, and he constantly searched for a deeper meaning for existence. His poetry is layered with religious symbolism and imagery, most of which was drawn from Christianity and the Bible. For example, the story of the creation of Adam and Eve and their life in paradise or the Garden of Eden before they sinned by eating an apple from the tree of knowledge is used as an extended metaphor throughout the poem. And of course, that extended metaphor has been used time and again by various writers as a metaphor for childhood and the loss of childhood innocence, which is what Dylan Thomas describes. Dylan Thomas is sometimes also described as something of a tortured artist because he battled alcoholism and financial instability throughout his life. He died quite young at the age of 39 in New York City on November the 9th, 1953, probably because he had pneumonia that had been exacerbated by his heavy drinking. However, his legacy continues to inspire writers and artists all over the world. This background to the poem is important because it will help you to understand the imagery that the poet uses. The poem was first published in 1945, just after the end of World War II, in which millions of people suffered and died. Perhaps it is unsurprising that after such a horrific war, the poem reflects on themes like the loss of childhood innocence and freedom, a growing awareness of death and old age, and nostalgia for a child's untroubled view of the world. Thomas spent much of his childhood on his Aunt Annie and Uncle Jim Jones's apple farm, which was called Fernwood. The farm is a setting for the poem. It is in Carmarthenshire in Wales, a very green and beautiful part of rural Wales in Great Britain, as you can see from the picture on the slide. Thomas loved the many holidays that he spent there. Fernwood Farm serves as a metaphor for paradise or the Garden of Eden, because Thomas used it to symbolize his completely happy, innocent, and untroubled childhood, and childhood in general. Of course, many children have horrific childhoods, so they never go through a phase of thinking that the world is a perfect place, just waiting for them to explore and have adventures in. However, Dylan Thomas describes his own childhood as being as untroubled as Adam and Eve's life was while they lived in the Garden of Eden or paradise before they sinned by eating the apple from the tree of knowledge. Remember that as soon as they ate that apple, they began to experience sin, suffering, and they became mortal and realized that one day they would die. Metaphorically, eating the apple led them to becoming adults and losing their childhood. Before we continue, I would suggest that you stop the video and spend 5 minutes making a mind map with some quick ideas about how children think about change, their place in the world, their own identity and death. The pictures on the slide might inspire you and give you some ideas. And hopefully this will make it easier for you to understand Thomas's imagery and use of language as he describes his own childhood from the perspective of a child. When you are thinking about the way that children think, you might have realized that they often think that everything in the world happens because of them. They don't think very much about the future unless they're looking forward to something exciting like a party. And if they have had a very happy childhood, they tend to assume that the world is a perfect place and that they will always be happy. They don't usually think about the fact that one day they will grow old, that they will have worries and responsibilities, and that they will eventually die. They also often have a completely illogical way of seeing the world. For example, if they cover their eyes, a very small child will think that no one can see them. Or they will think that if they can't see something, it doesn't actually exist. So when you hear Dylan Thomas describing what it was like to go to sleep when he was a child, think about the way that a small child thinks and sees the world, because that is often the language and the imagery that Dylan Thomas is using in the poem. Remember that small children also tend to confuse imagination and reality. For example, a small child might imagine that wild animals listen to them and take their orders, or that they must be royalty because adults are kind to them. And again, you're going to see that coming through in the poem. As I read the poem, remember that it is Dylan Thomas's attempt to describe a young child's experience of being brought up on a farm, and very importantly, how that experience seemed to be almost magical, mystical, a religious experience to him at the time. Of course, what makes this all a little bit more complicated is that the poem is not written by a child. The poem is written by the adult Dylan Thomas, who describes the way that he remembers the child, little Dylan Thomas, experiencing the world. And of course, he is writing from an adult point of view. And adult Dylan Thomas is mourning the fact that child Dylan Thomas grew up and lost his childlike, magical view of the world around him. It does seem a little bit ironic because adult Dylan Thomas is still able to see the farm through his younger eyes to the extent that he can describe what that was like. But the point he's making is that he can never again actually be in or experience those moments. All that he can do is remember and think about the past with nostalgia. And remember that nostalgia is a feeling of intense longing or affection for one's past. So as I read the poem, try to appreciate the music of the words and try to imagine seeing Fern Hill Farm through the eyes of a little boy who still felt that the world was a magical place. And if you would like to hear the way that Dylan Thomas would have read his poem with his Welsh lilt, just Google Dylan Thomas reading Fern Hill. I have added some of the sounds that Thomas mentions, those sounds of nature, just so that you can hopefully imagine the setting of the poem more clearly. And I'm now going to read the poem to you, and I would like you to try and picture what it is that Dylan Thomas is describing as I do so. Fern Hill. Now, as I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heyday of his eyes. And honoured among wagons I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns, about the happy yard and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be, golden in the mercy of his means. And green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman, the calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay, fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys, it was air, and playing lovely and watery, and fire green as grass. And nightly under the simple stars, as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the nightjars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake, and the farm like a wanderer, white with the dew, come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining, it was Adam and maiden. The sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light, in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. And honoured among foxes and pheasants by the gay house, under the new-made clouds, and happy as the heart was long. In the sun born over and over, I ran my heedless ways. My wishes raced through the house-high hay, and nothing I cared at my sky-blue trades that time allows, in all his tuneful turning, so few and such morning songs, before the children green and golden follow him out of grace. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. As I analyze the poem, I suggest that you take notes, highlight key phrases, and also make sure that you understand the technical language terms that I will use. I will remind you what the terms mean when I use them, and I suggest that you write them down, and particularly any definitions that you didn't already know. I will list them at the end of this presentation so that you can check that you understand and know all the key terms. It's very difficult to analyze literature and poetry if you cannot use the correct vocabulary. It's also a very good idea if you work with a copy of the poem in front of you, because then it's much easier for you to take notes. And as we go through the poem, remember that this poem is Dylan Thomas's attempt to describe a young child's experience of being brought up on a farm. What makes it a little bit more complicated is that the poem is written from the perspective of an adult Dylan Thomas, who is mourning the fact that he no longer has a child's understanding of the world, but he is describing that understanding of the world through the eyes of a child and in a child's voice. So just keep that in mind as you go along. Before we continue, think about the structure of the poem. You would have noticed that it consists of 6 verses or stanzas, and that each stanza contains 9 lines. There is no rhyme scheme. I've counted the number of syllables in each line and indicated this information in red in brackets. Remember that a syllable is the smallest unit of sound that a person can make. For example, and honored at the top of the slide is and on-ed, 3 syllables. What do you notice when you look at the words on the slide? As you can see, the line lengths vary enormously, but there is a pattern of line lengths because the number of syllables in each line is repeated in each stanza, which creates quite a regular rhythm throughout the poem. Did you notice as well that there are lots of very long sentences which are split over a lot of lines by means of enjambment? For example, the last 2 stanzas of the poem, which you can see on this page, are actually one long sentence. Don't get confused by the capitals at the beginning of each line. These don't actually mark the start of a new sentence, just the start of each line. And you'll notice that many lines end in commas as the poet lists all of his childhood experiences, and that there is only finally a full stop after the word see. So the long lines, the long sentences, and the long vowel sounds, for example in swallow, thronged, loft, slow the rhythm right down and emphasize that very thoughtful, reflective tone of the whole poem. And as there isn't any rhyme scheme, and there are some variations in the rhythm, this poem is technically written in free verse. However, remember that it has much more of a definite rhythm than most poems that are written in free verse. And also, Dylan Thomas has deliberately created a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables that mimics the lilting of the Welsh accent, and it gives this poem a very musical quality which enhances the nostalgic tone and the sense of childhood being a magical time. Fern Hill by Dylan Thomas. Now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs. The first line of the first stanza seems to start the poem off with a straightforward description of the setting. A young Dylan Thomas who had no worries or cares, implied by the word easy, growing up on his aunt and uncle's apple farm. He grew up under the branches or boughs of apple trees. Remember that in the story of Adam and Eve, which is told in the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian faiths, sin and an understanding of good and evil, suffering and death, started when Eve picked an apple from the appropriately named tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. In some traditions, of course, the fruit wasn't an apple, it was a pomegranate. But the point is that this is one of humanity's oldest stories about the loss of innocence. And this is what Dylan is alluding to. Remember that that's alluding with an A, and that allusion is a reference to a text outside of the poem. Here it's a reference to the Bible. And the fact that Dylan Thomas describes himself as under the apple boughs implies that he hasn't yet picked the apple. He is still innocent. He's still existing in a state of Adam and Eve and Eden-like innocence. And as you will see, Fernhill goes on to describe his loss of childhood innocence and his growing understanding of suffering and death. Also notice how Dylan mixes 2 tenses in this line. He starts with now, which is in the present tense, but then he uses was, which is obviously in the past. And this highlights that he's writing as an adult in the present or now, but he's also looking back and reliving and remembering his past experiences as a child. So in remembering in the present, he's actually mixing past and present. Notice that Dylan's choice of words, his diction, is very much an older form of English. It's archaic language that is typical of the Bible, like boughs, and that adds to his use of religious imagery and the atmosphere he creates of being in a divine or holy space while he was a child. About the lilting house and happy as the grass was green. In the line 2 of the first stanza, the line continues with Thomas's description of his upbringing under the branches of the apple tree, and about meaning around the lilting house, presumably a reference to the farmhouse where he was completely happy. Notice how the house has been personified as lilting, which means to sing or speak in a rhythmical, musical way that the Welsh normally speak. This is one of the first indications of a child's magical way of experiencing the world. For little Dylan Thomas, the house seemed to be speaking or singing to him, or it made him as happy as if he was being sung to. Thomas also describes himself with an unusual simile, as happy as the grass was green. As you saw from the picture earlier, the fields in Wales are very green, so Thomas is obviously saying he was very happy. He uses this colour symbolism throughout the poem, and if you think of the connotations of green, some of those are of new life, growth and hope, all of which are appropriate when describing Thomas's life at the time. The night above the dingle starry. In the third line of the first stanza, we have a continuation of the description of the beauty of the farm. At night, the small valley with trees, which is a dingle, would be below a beautiful starry night sky. Thomas creates an image of a starry night sky almost looking down on the farm tucked cozily into its valley. Remember that stars are a very old symbol of the light of heaven, hope and divine meaning. So there is this sense that heaven is looking after and looking over the farm and Dylan's childhood. In the fourth and fifth line of stanza 1, he says, "Time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes." In these lines, time is personified as a generous father figure that allowed Dylan Thomas to just play and to enjoy his surroundings without having to work or take responsibility for anything. Again, Thomas uses color symbolism, saying that he was golden in the heydays of time's eyes. Gold and golden have connotations of riches, treasures, and things that are precious or perfect. Also remember that gold never rusts, which is why it is a symbol of purity. And your heydays are the best days of your life. For example, you might describe your matric year as having been your heydays. Here the poet describes time as watching his younger self with love and affection, and how Thomas was innocent and pure and enjoying the best days of his life. And time, which is personified here, was merciful enough to just let him do that. As is typical of a child, Thomas implies that at the time he had no idea of how short his childhood would be, or how precious the gift of being a child was, with nothing to do but actually play. So he couldn't even fully appreciate what he had because he didn't know that he could lose it, although he certainly seems to have enjoyed being a child. And honoured among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns. In the sixth line, you can see a picture of a typical farm wagon. You can imagine Dylan riding on the farm wagons as they delivered their loads of apples to the local market towns, and how the poet imagined that he was a prince, riding in a carriage as the local people honoured him. Of course, he wasn't literally royalty, he was just a little farm boy, but again, we're seeing a childhood experience through the imaginative eyes of a child. And we're also seeing a child's tendency to make themselves the most important person in anything that is happening, and to see everything that is happening in terms of themselves. In lines 7 and 8 of stanza 1, he says, "And once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley." This line continues with the idea of the young Dylan Thomas imagining that he was a prince, who seems to have had supernatural powers, as he ordered in a very lordly way that the trees and leaves of the farm should be draped with daisies and barley, so the daisies and barley trails from them. This is typical of a very young child's view of the world, which is basically very self-centered. As I said, they tend to believe that everything happens for and because of them. And I've included a picture of barley here. You can see it looks a lot like wheat, and daisies. Remember that daisies are a very, very old symbol of purity, innocence, and new beginnings. And barley is a symbol of plenty and abundance because it's a symbol of having enough nutrition to thrive and grow. So obviously daisies and barley symbolize the poet's experience of his childhood. It was innocent, it was abundant, it was richly blessed. Also notice that Thomas changes the traditional fairy tale introduction of once upon a time to once below a time. By doing this, Thomas is subverting or turning upside down the traditional fairy tale, and he's emphasizing that this isn't actually a fairy tale. This was his childhood. And even though he wasn't aware of the passage of time as a child, time was still passing, and he was in time, and therefore he's foreshadowing or showing us that he is inevitably going to grow up, grow old, and lose his innocence. So remember, foreshadowing is when an author or speaker implies that something negative is going to happen in the future by leaving little clues in the text. Down the rivers of the windfall light. In line 9 of the first stanza, we have a continuation of the image of the young Dylan Thomas ordering that his world be draped or decorated with trails of barley and daisies, so that they look like they flow like a river in the windfall light. Remember that light, like stars, symbolizes heaven, and this emphasizes the poet's childhood feeling that his childhood was blessed. This ties in with the description of light as a windfall, because a windfall is literally when fruit, like apples, are blown from a tree so that you can just eat it without having to bother with picking it. In idiomatic English, remember, idiomatic English is metaphorical language that people use as part of their everyday speech and everyone understands. A windfall is something good that happens unexpectedly. Here, Dylan highlights how children often notice and are grateful for simple things that adults take for granted. As a child, he saw the beautiful sunlight as an unexpected blessing, or a windfall. You would have noticed how much of the sensory imagery in this whole stanza has focused on what the poet could see around him. So he makes a lot of use of visual imagery, and you can just imagine a young child drinking in the beauties of his surroundings. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home, the second stanza begins with the word and you'll notice in these two lines, 10 and 11, that even though the previous stanza ended with a full stop, there is this feeling that the thought of all the blessings of Dylan Thomas's childhood are just continuing. And the poet goes on to list the happy experiences of this childhood. In line 11, he uses the word green, again with the connotations of green, hope, new life, and growth. To say that someone is green is also an idiomatic or colloquial expression. Remember, colloquial means conversational English. That means that they are lacking in experience and ties in with the theme of the poet's childhood innocence and vulnerability. Carefree is a slightly old-fashioned or archaic English word that refers to having nothing to worry about. When the poet says he was famous among the barns and personifies the yard as happy, he's speaking as a small child would typically think. Again, that he's the most important person in the world and that everything around him, including the buildings, is thinking about him and is focused on him. In the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means. So in the second stanza, lines 12 to 14, Thomas has repeated the image of time personified, or Father Time, who allows the young Dylan Thomas to remain innocent and ignorant of how time and growing up generally adds to a person's worries and responsibilities. This is why Thomas describes time as letting him play and as having mercy. Saying that he was golden in the mercy of time's means implies that the figure of time personified was as merciful as he could possibly have been. Time acted within his means to the child Dylan Thomas. By describing himself as golden at the time, Thomas implies that he was treated as though he was infinitely precious, almost divine. It is as though he was covered in the golden light of heaven. When the poet says that the sun is young once only, he is not speaking in the literal geological sense, but is describing a child's perception that each day is a wonderful new adventure and experience, almost as though they are experiencing the world for the very first time every single time. This enthusiasm for life obviously passes as children grow up and they become old and tired and cynical, which is why it seems to Thomas that the sun is young once only. It feels as though each day is as new and special as the first day was at the beginning of time for a child. And once he loses that sense of appreciation, he can never ever get it back. And you can see from this slide, what he's depicting is this idea of time being merciful and watching him, but knowing that his childhood innocence and his lack of care in childhood is going to run out. And green and golden, I was huntsman and herdsman, the calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold. In stanza 2, lines 15 and 16, I've just played an audio clip of a hunter blowing on a horn as he gallops after a fox with his dogs yelping and barking behind him. This is to help you to imagine what the young Dylan Thomas was imagining as he played on the farm. In these lines, the poet describes how he believed he was powerful and in control of his world, that as a child he believed that he was a huntsman or a hunter and a herder of animals, but in reality he was highly unlikely to be doing very much real farm work. In his imagination, he would blow on his horn like the hunter in a traditional English fox hunt that you heard, but instead of the hunter's dogs yelping in response, the calves would sing back at him, and he would hear the foxes, which are the animals that people usually hunt in Britain, barking in response. Again, this is a magical vision of a child rather than what literally happened. And if you want to know what a fox looks like, there's a picture of one on the left there. They're not very big, they're about the size of a terrier. You would have also noticed that Thomas uses the color symbolism here of green and golden again, and he links them through that alliteration of the G sound to show that he felt both new and blessed as a child, and that the two states of being were linked. And the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. In stanza 2, lines 17 to 18, you can see why Dylan Thomas is sometimes called a late romantic poet. Remember that romantic artists and writers always expressed a sense of awe and reverence when they experienced nature. In many cases, they described nature as being where they could feel the presence of God or the divine. In these lines, Dylan Thomas describes how he had this feeling of being in the presence of something holy when he experienced nature as a child. You'll probably know that the Sabbath is the holy day of rest described in the Christian Old Testament, the Jewish Torah, and the Islamic Quran. In terms of the story of creation, having created the world, God decreed that there should be a day of rest and reflection that humanity was told to keep sacred or holy. Traditionally, church bells would be rung to tell Christians to go and worship on the Sabbath or on Sunday in Christianity. But in Dylan Thomas's childhood, the sound of water running over pebbles would remind him to be reverent because, being in nature, he felt as though he was surrounded by a holy presence. And as you listened to the sound of the stream running, you could imagine the effect that hearing this had on Dylan Thomas and on his sense of childlike wonder. You would have noticed that this stanza also included a great deal of sound imagery throughout, and that this sensory or auditory imagery reinforced the sense that he was being soaked in beauty and that he was completely surrounded by and saturated with sensory stimulation from this world of his childhood that felt like Eden or paradise. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay fields as high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys, it was air and playing, lovely and watery. So what I played for you there was a clip of the sound of wind flowing around chimneys. And in these lines, the poet describes what every day on the farm, which is the it that he describes, was like. It was running, it was lovely, it was about playing in hay fields that were as high as the house, and it was hearing the tunes from the chimneys, probably the sounds of the wind in the chimneys, similar to what you heard there, air and playing. Notice how the reference to tunes from the chimneys ties in with the previous personification of the house as singing, and his childish perception that the house was alive and seemed to be watching him and that it loved him. Saying that his days were watery links these lines back to that previous image of the holy streams, and it continues with the idea that the poet's childhood felt blessed and that he had the sense that he was being cared for by a divine presence that he experienced through nature. Think about the connotations of water. It's linked to ideas of purity, and it's also impossible to hold on to as it flows. So can you see how Thomas is implying that his childhood had the same qualities of purity and being impossible to hold on to as water does? And he's starting to imply that childhood cannot last, and he's starting to foreshadow that it is going to end. And fire green as grass, and nightly under the simple stars, as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. So as you could hear as I read the lines, there was the sound of an owl in the background. And these lines, 22 to 24 of stanza 3, contain some very interesting images that at first sight seem to be very, very confusing. So the first reference to fire green as grass is completely paradoxical because fire is generally not green. However, if you think about the symbolism of green as being new life and how fire has connotations of warmth and energy, you can see that Dylan Thomas is using color symbolism and that he's describing the world through the eyes of a child. So children are not preconditioned to automatically think of fire as red. And a child would associate green fire with magic as well. And we've talked a lot about a child's magical interpretation or vision of the world. So green fire can only be a product of magic or dreams. And then just remember that a paradox is a statement that seems to be illogical or contradictory, but on closer examination, it actually tells a greater truth. So the greater truth here is about the nature of childhood and the way in which the young Dylan Thomas would see the world. So this idea of magical perception then continues in the next two lines. Have you noticed how throughout the poem, Dylan Thomas repeats certain imagery? In these lines, and nightly under the simple stars, Thomas refers back to the stars that were over the dingle or valley where the farm was located. And here he describes what it was like falling asleep as a child and hearing the owls hooting as he went to sleep. Because remember, owls are nocturnal, and that soundtrack was of some owls. And his last thoughts as he drifts off are of the farm, and from his childish perspective, it's as though the owls are carrying the farm away from him as they fly past, because obviously he's gradually losing consciousness as he drifts off to sleep and he stops being aware of the farm. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the nightjars flying with the ricks and the horses flashing into the dark. You would have noticed in these lines, 25 to 27 of stanza 3, that there are many references to time, and that these are a repetition of the references to time that appear throughout the poem. The movement of the sun, moon, and stars are humanity's oldest means of knowing how much time has passed and how the seasons have passed and what season is going to come next. Have you noticed how often Thomas refers to the sun, moon, and stars? And he does this to highlight the fact that his childhood was passing quickly, but he was also happily unaware of the passage of time when he was a child. Describing the passing of a night as all the moon long is also a very childlike way of describing the passing of night. And of course, it's a parallel line to all the sun long from line 19. These lines continue the idea of his childhood having a quality of being divinely blessed. And you can see in the slide there are actually some pictures of nightjars, those birds that made the sounds that you heard. They're also birds like owls that are only active at night. And again, we get a child's vision of what happens tonight. He probably mixes the sound of the nightjars in with his dreams. And what he imagines is that the nightjars are flying along with the big piles of hay. Those are hay ricks. You can see those big round bales of hay in the picture. And in between, the horses look as though they're flashing in the dark. Of course, the ricks are not literally flying, and horses don't literally flash. It just looks that way because they seem to appear and disappear at night, depending on whether or not the moonlight is falling on them or if they're in shadow and disappearing. And then to awake in the farm like a wanderer white with dew come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining. It was Adam and Maiden. So in lines 28 to 30 of stanza 4, the poet describes how after a night of vivid dreams and imaginary adventures, what it was like to wake up on Fern Hill Farm. From his childish perspective, the farm seems to come back to him like a wanderer, like someone that's been off traveling somewhere. He personifies the farm, as he has the childish sense that the farm loves him as much as he loves it. And when he talks about it as a wanderer, he's describing his childish feeling that the farm had gone somewhere while he was asleep, as opposed to an adult's perception that he had just lost consciousness and awareness and that the farm hadn't actually gone anywhere at all. The idea of the cock being on the farm's shoulder is a continuation of this personification. The farm is described as a person that returns to the poet, and that is white with dew and has a rooster, a male chicken, or a cock sitting on his shoulder close to his ear. And roosters or male chickens start crowing at dawn. I hope you enjoyed that soundtrack. So this image implies that the rooster is the farm's friend, and he's telling the farm, and perhaps even the child Dylan Thomas, by crowing in his ear like a buddy, that it's time to get up. And of course, it's another reference to time. The semicolon, that punctuation mark that looks like a full stop balanced on top of another full stop in line 29, introduces Dylan's explanation of what those dawns on the farm felt like to him at the time. And he says it was all shining. It was Adam and Maiden. This is obviously a continuation of the image of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden that was alluded to in the very first lines of the poem. Here Dylan refers to Adam and Eve before they ate from the tree of knowledge. You'll remember from the first lines of the poem when he was beneath the apple boughs. And it was before God ejected them from the Garden of Eden or paradise as a punishment for their disobedience. It was before they understood sin and death and suffering. Notice that Dylan Thomas doesn't say Adam and Eve, because that would have connotations of Eve being a woman and Adam's wife and all the sexual connotations that go with that. He was still a child, and so the person in the place of Eve is just a nameless maiden. And remember, maiden is an archaic or much older English word for a young girl. So Adam is a symbol of the poet as a child. Like Adam before the fall, he's got no awareness of sexuality, sin, death, the passage of time. He's just blessed and blissfully happily on the farm. And sometimes he would play on the farm with his little friend, which would have been a little girl. And to him, the farm is like paradise or the Garden of Eden, just this uncomplicated place of pure happiness where every need is taken care of and all he's got to do with his time is enjoy his life. In lines 31 to 34 of stanza 4, Dylan describes the sun rising from his childish perspective. Again, he uses religious imagery. He describes the sky as having gathered again, which continues with the idea that it went somewhere along with the farm while he was asleep. When he says that the sun grew round that very day, obviously the sun wasn't created on a day in Thomas's childhood, but because young children sometimes behave like every day is a new adventure and very exciting, it was like he was Adam on the very first day of creation. Every day when he woke up on the farm, he was so excited to explore and enjoy this paradise place that he was like Adam. He then says that the way he felt as a child waking up on the farm was probably similar to Adam's awe when Adam witnessed God creating the universe in the creation story. And he uses the lines, the birth of the simple light in the first spinning place, which is a beautiful description of the creation of the universe right at the beginning of time. From the poet's childish perspective, even the horses seem to realize that they're witnessing the creation of a new world, or to feel like that, which is why he describes them as spellbound when they woke up on this first beautiful new day. Out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. So these lines 35 and 36 in stanza 4 continue with that image of being spellbound, which means to be captured by magic or enchanted. And these horses seem to be absolutely dazed by the beauty of the new morning. They are spellbound as they walk out of their stable in the morning and out onto the fields. The stable is described as though it is a horse, not a person, so you can't say it's personification. And there isn't a technical term of horseification, but I suppose it's a bit like what's being done here. From the child's point of view, it's like the stable is whinnying. He can just hear the noise of the horses calling to each other, which is obviously what you heard on that soundtrack. And they're doing that as they wake up. And when Thomas says that the stable is green, it probably literally wasn't green. Again, it's that color symbolism of new life, a new day, growth. And it's almost like the horses are whinnying in praise of the new day. And he says when they come out onto the fields of praise, they're walking out of the stables into the fields, and it's a continuation of this idea that nature itself is holy, and that everything in nature, all the animals, all the streams, the rivers, the trees, actually realize that they're part of something divine, and that as a child he had an experience of feeling as though he was in the presence of something divine when he was outside on this beautiful farm surrounded by nature. And here he describes the fields as praising God, or perhaps being grateful because they are so blessed. And honoured among foxes and pheasants by the gay house, under the new-made clouds, and happy as the heart was long, in the sun born over and over. So in lines 37 to 39 of stanza 9, the poet continues with the image of himself as a boy, feeling as though he was royalty on the farm, and that all the animals, the foxes and the pheasants, those are wild animals that would have been on the farm, honored him, just as people would honor their prince. The house here is personified as gay, which at the time meant full of joy, and it seems to him that the world is like it has only just been created. He describes the clouds as new made. When Dylan Thomas says that the sun was born over and over, this highlights how, in his enthusiasm, every day felt as fresh and awe-inspiring as the very first day of the creation of the world. So it's a continuation of that imagery of Adam and Eve on the first day of creation. Notice how he changes that idiomatic expression to be as happy as the day is long. Remember, idioms are metaphors that are a common part of everyday conversation in a particular language or culture. And And he changes to be as happy as the day is long, to as happy as the heart was long, highlighting how his happiness would last as long as he could keep his childhood sense of awe and innocent enjoyment, and as long as he could be big-hearted. Big-hearted meaning to be full of love and generosity and appreciation. And he's implying that once one becomes an adult, you are no longer big-hearted. You no longer have a heart that is long or long-lasting. In some senses, you lose your heart. You lose your emotional connection to everything that is around you. I ran my heedless ways, my wishes raced through the house-high hay. In lines 40 and 41 of stanza 5, the word heedless is a slightly archaic word, meaning to do something with a complete lack of caution or fear. Looking back, Dylan Thomas remembers how he ran wherever and whenever he wanted to on the farm, without ever being afraid, worried, or feeling responsible for anything, or having to do any work. All, I'm sure, are words that you will recognize as describing adulthood. And the fact that his wishes also raced implies that he could do anything he wanted to, and that his wishes were quite wild and energetic as his behavior. So not even his wishes were restrained. And the image of the hay being house high reinforces the idea that this is a memory of the way that he saw things as a child rather than the way things actually were. Because children are small, even relatively small things look huge, so the height of the hay looked very tall. And children tend to distort size. He remembers the hay as being as high as the house, but it probably wasn't. If anything, it would have just come up to his head because he was so short. And nothing I cared at my sky blue trades that time allows, in all his tuneful turning, so few and such morning songs, before the children green and golden follow him out of grace. In stanza 5, lines 42 to 45, the poet again comments on the fact that he didn't notice or care that he was getting older. Note the connotations of the color symbolism of sky blue. A blue sky is a sky you see when there is no sign of bad weather to come. Symbolically, there's no sign that there will be hard times in the future. The word trade implies that the poet was making some sort of bargain or deal with the personified figure of time. Time allowed him a carefree childhood, but the implication is that at some point in the future he would pay a price for it, because trading always involves a benefit in return for some form of payment. So there is some kind of foreshadowing that things are going to change here. The reference to time's tuneful turning can be seen as a reference to the turning of the hands of a clock, which is why I've included this picture on the slide, but it's also a reference to an ancient philosophical belief. The ancient Greeks believed that the sun, moon, stars, and planets all moved along divinely ordained pathways or orbits, and as they did so, they produced a kind of cosmic music. And symbolically, the music of the spheres, which is what they called it, represents divine order and the idea that everything in the universe is operating exactly as it should. And some people believed that the music of the spheres was created by invisible crystal balls or spheres turning against one another. So they would have produced the kind of sound you get, which you heard, when you wet the rim of a wine glass and you run your finger around it. So this reference to time's tuneful turning implies that the poet understood that his inevitable aging and loss of innocence is part of the natural order, and that is how life should proceed. Of course, he only understood this when he was an adult and when he had already lost his innocence and started aging. He didn't understand it when he was a child. And that, of course, is a very important idea, because with the loss of childhood innocence and when Adam and Eve ate the apple, the consequences weren't entirely negative. This is what people often miss out on. Yes, they suffered sin and death, but they also gained knowledge, which is a blessing. That's the reason why the tree was called the tree of knowledge. It's also known as the tree of good and evil. And of course, that's why that story is sometimes taken as a metaphor for growing up and the end of childhood, because when you grow up, you lose innocence, but you also gain knowledge. So Dylan Thomas is commenting here on how short childhood is. The time personified only allows a few such morning songs, referring to the song of praise to the morning that the rooster sang in the previous stanza, and that the poet's celebration of the morning. And he's saying that once children have been allowed their brief, untroubled childhood, their innocence, symbolized by the associations of green and golden, which are repeated in these lines, then the poet says they follow time out of grace. And I suppose the trade is that they trade their innocence in for knowledge. Remember that a state of grace is a religious idea, and it means that a person is without sin and is favored by God. And they trade in that state of grace in return for knowledge and understanding. And in most religious traditions, children are considered to be incapable of sin because they don't understand the difference between good and evil. This means that children are technically sinless or innocent, and therefore favored by God and in a permanent state of grace. And it's ironic that the poet noticed all the signs of time passing, the movement of the sun, the moon, and the stars, but he still had no idea that he was getting increasingly close to the end of his childhood and his time of pure, unadulterated, uncomplicated happiness. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days that time would take me up to the swallowed, thronged loft by the shadow of my hand. So in these lines 46 and 47 of stanza 6, the poet describes that as a child his days were lamb white. And the white lamb is an ancient religious symbol or metaphor for purity, which ties in with his perception of his childhood. For example, in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, Abraham or Ibrahim, depending which text you're referring to, sacrifices a white lamb to God instead of his son Isaac or Isaac. In Christianity, Jesus is often depicted as a lamb and is described as the Lamb of God because that is a symbol of a perfect sacrifice, because a white lamb is regarded as unblemished, perfectly pure, and Jesus was symbolically pure and sinless and innocent. Therefore, using the imagery of a white lamb, Thomas is implying that he was an innocent sacrifice to time, and that he was completely unaware of how much he would suffer in adulthood, or of the pain that he would feel when he lost his childhood. So the change in tone here is really dramatic. There's this terrifying image of a little child trustingly taking an adult's hand and being led into the dark space in the roof of a house, the loft, which is normally a very dirty, neglected space for storage of old things that you don't really use anymore, which could be described as a person's childhood once they reach adulthood. The adult in this image is time personified, and the implication is that the child did not even realize that time was leading him out of childhood and into a dark and frightening future or adulthood. And I think that's why he uses that image of the shadow of his hand. Shadows are things that are not concrete. They go in front of the real concrete living being. So this was him kind of growing up in advance before he realized that he was growing up. The loft can be seen as symbolizing adolescence or the time of growing up. And the description of this loft being thronged, which means crowded with swallows, is significant. You can see swallows in the slide. They are migratory birds. They fly away every autumn to get away from the cold, and they come back at the beginning of spring. So they represent the end of the seasons of new life and growth, spring and summer. Swallows can also represent freedom and movement. The fact that they're about to migrate indicates that the poet was about to lose his freedom and movement, because swallows congregate, they get together, and they migrate in a big flock together. Notice how the poet's relationship with time shifts in these lines. Before, time was depicted as a kindly father figure who allowed the poet to play happily. But in this really heartbreaking image, the boy follows time with complete trust, not knowing that he's being led towards suffering. So time is increasingly portrayed as a threatening figure that this boy should be afraid of, but he doesn't have the knowledge to be afraid of. In the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields. In lines 58 to 60 of stanza 6, the poet continues with a description of the losses and changes that he was unaware of at the time of his childhood. He did not realize that time continues relentlessly, and this is an image that comes through in The Moon is Always Rising. He also did not realize that every night when he went to sleep as a child, symbolized by that idea of him riding to sleep, as though sleep was some sort of mythological transport to a magical land, that he would lose some of his childhood. Time would then metaphorically fly away with his childhood experiences and magical perceptions of the farm. So you've got an image here of time taking the farm away from the poet. The poet describes having had a faint awareness that things were changing. He could hear time fly with the high fields, but as a child, he did not know enough to care because he didn't realize the value of what he was losing. Dylan Thomas describes this process of loss in the same way that a child would describe a dream, not knowing the difference between a dream and reality. And I've tried to show a child's vision of that process of going to sleep on this slide. So remember that it can function on two levels. It can function as a description of Thomas's dreams and imagination at the time of his childhood, or as a metaphor for time taking away his perceptions and experiences of his beloved place on Fern Hill Farm. And wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. If you listen to line 51 of stanza 6, you will hear how brutal it sounds and how the tone has completely changed to one of terrible sadness and despair. In this line, the adult poet mourns his loss of his childhood feeling that the farm and that the world were completely beautiful and absolutely trouble-free and perfect. He describes this loss as the farm having run away in terror or fled from the land or state of mind that he now exists in. This state of mind is described as a childless land. The implication of this line is that the poet has grown up, and in doing so, he's lost his inner child. It was destroyed in the loft that was previously described, and because of that, he can no longer experience or live in the Fern Hill farm of his childhood. Notice that the farm has fled from the poet, not the other way around. And the implication is that the poet is no longer pure and innocent because he's grown up. And as an impure adult, he cannot experience the farm in the way that he did as a child. The farm rejects him or retreats from him, as Adam and Eve were unable to live in paradise or the Garden of Eden after they'd eaten from the tree of knowledge, because they had become impure. The poet also emphasizes that the change was sudden. He went to sleep as a child on a beautiful farm that was a magical place for him, and he woke in a bleak and unwelcoming, childless land. He was obviously still on the farm, but because he had changed, his perception and experience of the farm had changed. And I'm sure you can relate to that. Sometimes when you go through a life-changing event, even though the things and the people around you don't change, your experience of them is so different that they might as well have. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. So as you listen to the sea, as I read those final lines of the poem, lines 52 to 54 of stanza 6, you would have heard that in these lines the poet summarizes his adult view of his childhood. Looking back at his childhood, Dylan Thomas realizes that his younger self was young and easy, as he did not have to worry about anything. He was at ease, and nothing that he wanted to do was difficult, which is another meaning of it was easy. He did not realize that his being ignorant of what was to come and what he would lose as an adult was actually a gift. Time personified had acted out of mercy and had done his best to provide the boy poet with an untroubled childhood. Dylan Thomas describes how he was in the mercy of time's means or ability. At the time, Dylan Thomas didn't realize that he was both green and dying. This is an oxymoron because the two words seem to contradict each other. The word green implies the poet's youth and the fact that he was at the beginning of his life, and dying implies reaching the end of life after being aged. And the greater truth behind that paradoxical description is that people start dying from the moment that they start living. Every moment of life takes us closer to death. And of course, the way in which time was merciful to the poet was that in Dylan Thomas's childhood, he didn't realize that he was actually on the way towards death. He was on the way to being captured by adult worries and responsibilities. And time was as merciful to him as possible. So time was acting as much as he could within his means. The final image is one in which Thomas describes how he, as a child, sang in his chains like the sea. He was so happy and enjoying his childhood so much that he did not realize that he was also completely at the mercy of time, aging, and ultimately of death, those are represented by chains. And the connotations of the sea, if you think about the sound of the sea when you listen to that audio, are the ability to move freely and constantly. The sea is never silent. The sound of waves is constant, implying that the sea never stops singing. And even when there are chains in the sea is not aware of the chains, and the sea doesn't alter its behavior because of the chains. And chains can never stop the sea from moving or metaphorically singing. So the poet implies that he was not prevented from celebrating the beauty of his childhood because of the constraints of time or mortality. Notice that he uses the past tense of sing, which is sang. This can be read that he is no longer able to sing or have those uncomplicated, pure experiences of childhood. And again, it's linked back to that idea that's run through the whole poem, the cost of becoming an adult. And the poet's final tone is one of deep mourning for his past self, nostalgia for his lost childhood, and gratitude for his wonderful experiences as a child. Before you start answering the question, make sure that you understand the technical language used. So the question is, in the poem Fern Hill, Dylan Thomas suggests that in order to truly appreciate the beauty and magic of childhood, we first have to lose it by growing up. Critically assess the validity of this statement. Substantiate your response with references to the tone, diction, and imagery used in the poem. So critically assess means to discuss an idea from multiple perspectives and to give evidence from your answers for your answer from the text. And in this case, the text is obviously the poem. When you assess validity, you're deciding if a statement is true, false, or somewhat true. With a question like this, you have all three options open to you. Remember that tone is the emotions that an author or speaker conveys with their words. It is related to mood, but it's not identical. Mood is the way that a reader or audience is made to feel, and unlike with tone, no speaker is necessary. Diction is the poet's choice of words and imagery and refers to figures of speech like sensory imagery, metaphors, similes, and personification. I'm only going to give you some suggestions of things that you could comment on if you were asked to write this poetry essay in the exam. And I will talk you through the process of structuring a poetry essay as I discuss a possible answer. This is a very long, complex poem, so there are literally hundreds of things you could talk about. This is just a sample. An introduction to a literature essay should always include your hypothesis, which is the big idea that you're setting out to prove. Start your hypothesis with the name of the text and the author, and then rephrase the question as a statement. In this way, you'll hopefully stick to the question throughout your essay, because that statement is what you're trying to prove throughout. You must also include a sentence where you explain how you are going to structure your essay. And notice that your introduction is very short, 2 or 3 sentences at the most. So I'm now going to give my introduction and check that you should check that I've actually done as I advise. So this is my introduction. In Fern by Dylan Thomas, the poet suggests that in order to truly appreciate the beauty and magic of childhood, ironically, we first have to lose our childhood by growing up. This perspective can be seen in his tone, diction, and use of imagery. Notice that in my overview statement, I said that I would discuss tone, diction, and use of imagery. Therefore, the body of my essay needs to consist of 3 paragraphs in the same order as my overview statement. I would start with a paragraph on tone, then include one on diction, and finally have one on imagery. And I would need to link each of those paragraphs to the idea that we cannot truly appreciate the beauty and magic of childhood while we are still a child. We have to grow up and lose that beauty and magic, become adults in order to appreciate it. Each paragraph in the body of my essay needs to contain at least one argument that's linked to the topic of the paragraph. And remember that an argument always consists of a point that you're trying to prove, evidence from the poem that proves that point, and an explanation of how the evidence proves the point. And remember that your evidence can be a quote, or it can be a specific explanation that is based on the text, but you've actually explained what's in the text in your own words, which is paraphrasing. Either one is good. To remember the structure of an argument, remember the acronym PEE, which stands for Point, Evidence, Explanation. And you can add an L for a linking sentence so that you make a link to your next paragraph. As I read out my suggested body of the essay, listen out for that peel structure. So this is a suggestion for the body of the essay. First of all, the tone paragraph. Dylan Thomas's tone shifts in his poem Fern Hill. In the first 5 stanzas, the poet's tone is nostalgic as he describes the magic of his childhood. For example, he describes how he imagined that he was a lord and all of the people and animals on the farm were his subjects. He says he was honored among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns, and he was famous among the barns. He describes the simple pleasures of a wonderful childhood, as it was running, it was lovely, the hay, fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys, it was air. Notice how he used a long list of things that he would do as a child to reinforce his sense of breathless excitement, and that it was lovely. And that as he ran his heedless ways, which implies that he had nothing to worry or care about, because heed means to take care. You'll also notice that he used a lot of enjambment, which continues that idea of a long series of happy activities. The tone becomes far more ominous in the final stanza, where the poet foreshadows the suffering that adulthood is to bring him. Here he says that as a result of growing up and losing his sense of childish wonder, he would one day wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land, which implies that he had grown up so that the farm became childless, and in doing so he lost his place of childhood wonder, which is why he says the farm had forever fled. In this stanza, the personified figure of time is no longer described as a benevolent figure that let the poet hail and climb as he did in stanza 1, or play as in stanza 2, or allow him sky blue trades with the implications of an untroubled childhood in stanza 4. Instead, in stanza 6, time is described as leading the poet up to a swallow-filled loft, which is a dark and frightening space, and the poet is described as not caring, nothing I cared, implying that he was ignorant and innocent and didn't realize how much he was going to be hurt. This is a major shift in tone and diction from that which is celebratory and awful to that which is ominous and quite frightening. The final lines in which time is described as holding the poet green and dying as he sang in his chains like the sea, present time in a very ambiguous way as both caring and threatening, because chains has connotations of a jailer who's been involved in the poet's dying. The poet's use of diction creates a tone of deep mourning, implying that he had no idea that he was losing the beauty and magic of childhood because he was still enjoying it. And he's also mourning the death of his inner child while celebrating the beauty of his lost childhood ability to celebrate or sing, even when he could never escape the consequences or chains of aging and growing up. So from this, one can see that the diction used throughout the poem reinforces the change in tone from celebratory to mourning, and it mirrors the poet's shift in perspective from a magical, awful depreciation of a child to the sad and weary perspective of a jaded adult. For example, at the start of the poem, the diction implies that his experience of Fern Hill Farm was a deeply spiritual one, in which he felt profoundly blessed. He describes how he was both green, which implies his youth, new life, hope, and growth, and golden, implying that he was valued, couldn't be corrupted, and was to be treasured like gold is when he was a child. However, the poet describes adulthood in brutal terms, implying that it is painful and the opposite of childhood, with words like chains. The poet doesn't specifically describe adulthood very much, but he implies that it is the sad and silent opposite of childhood. And he describes how growing up happens when children follow time out of grace, and that diction of grace means a blessed state of perfect purity and innocence. And the implication is therefore that adulthood involves corruption and suffering. When Thomas describes his childhood experiences, he also uses diction that describes his vision of childhood and the way he saw the world as a child as somewhat magical and often in supernatural terms. For example, as a child, he described fire green as grass and the feeling that the streams on the farms were holy, and that the sound of the running water allowed him to feel the presence of the divine because, as he said, the Sabbath rang slowly in the sound of the running water. So then finally, my imagery paragraph. The imagery used throughout the poem highlights this idea of adulthood, being at the cost of childhood joy. And perhaps this is most obvious in Thomas's use of the extended metaphor of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden or paradise, being like his boyhood self in the time before the fall. The poem opens with a description of the poet being young and easy under the apple boughs. Like Eve was before she ate of the tree of knowledge, the poet was completely untroubled or easy. When he woke every day on the farm, it felt as though each new day had been created just for him, and he was as filled with awe as he imagines Adam and Eve must have been when the universe was first created, saying that so it must have been after the birth of the simple light. Finally, when he grows up, seemingly almost overnight in his sleep, he wakens one morning to find that the farm has forever fled from the childless land, suggesting that, like Adam and Eve, once he has lost his childhood innocence, he can never return to paradise, which is the child's state of total appreciation and love of nature and the beauty of the farm. Like Adam and Eve, Dylan Thomas was unaware of the fact that he lived in a state of grace or paradise until he lost it. In the final stanza, he highlights his ignorance at the time. He says that time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. Then your conclusion is your final paragraph, and it needs to be a short summary of why your hypothesis is correct. This is my conclusion. Based on the poet's shift in tone from celebrating the joy and innocence of childhood to mourning its loss, his use of contrasting diction when describing childhood and adulthood, and his use of imagery in which he compares himself to Adam in the Garden of Eden, it is obvious that Dylan Thomas suggests that he needed knowledge and an understanding of suffering and death in order to fully appreciate the magic and beauty of his childhood. This knowledge could paradoxically only be obtained by losing his childhood innocence and finally growing up. And also paradoxically, he's grateful that he didn't have this knowledge as a child, because it would have robbed him of a childhood of simple joy, and he never would have been able to experience that childhood. As a child, Dylan Thomas was able to sing in his chains like the sea, precisely because he had no idea of what was in store for him. But he could only write this poem and fully appreciate what he had lost once he had lost it and realized the scale of his loss. So note that you don't have to agree with my views. You could have a totally different opinion, and you could still get 100% for a right answer. Remember that the only correct answers in literature are those that you can prove with evidence from the text. Also note that I've given a far longer essay than would fit into 250 words, because I wanted to give you lots of examples and just get you thinking. And you can use the structure that I've described to write any literature essay or any other discursive essay, for example, history essays. I will create a specific video on discursive essay writing, but this just demonstrates a hopefully helpful formula that you can use. Let's provide you with a list of the vocabulary that I've used in this presentation. It is listed in the order in which it was used. Check that you understand each word, make sure that you can spell it correctly, and then hopefully you will enjoy using it when you're talking about this poem, but all of your literature as well. And these terms are also often applicable in the language paper. I'm going to read them out loud just so that you know how they're pronounced. So general vocabulary, we talk about the Romantic era in poetry and a mood or tone of nostalgia. Vocabulary about structure, you can talk about this being a lyric poem. Diction, including colloquial or conversational language and archaic language. Syllables and syllable break. Rhyme and rhythm scheme. Verse and stanza. Enjambment. Free verse. Parallel lines or sentences. And repetition. The figures of speech used in this poem are listed here. Please don't mix them up with parts of speech. Remember, parts of speech are things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, etc. Figures of speech are very different. They are the techniques used to make language more interesting and more effective. So some of the figures of speech we discussed are subjective language, biased or emotive diction, mood and tone, connotations and implications, symbols or symbolism and color symbolism, very important in this poem, allusion with an A, which means reference to an outside text, personification, metaphors, similes, and extended metaphors, sensory imagery, subversion or to subvert, which literally means to turn upside down, but it means taking something and using it in a completely different way, foreshadowing, paradox, irony, and oxymorons. And then the phonic devices, those are language techniques that affect the way that a poem sounds when it is read out loud. There's rhyme, remember to spell it, rhyme has you and me. Rhythm, spelt rhythm has your two hips moving, and I've highlighted the letters of the little rhyme that you can use to remember these by. Alliteration and sibilance, assonance and onomatopoeia. Thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. I have created this channel so that any learner or teacher who's working with the South African NSC curriculum can have access to detailed teaching and learning materials. If you would like to support me in producing these videos, please like and subscribe my channel and pass the link on to any of your friends who would find this useful. You are also very welcome to make a small donation to support the continuation of this work. You're not expected to, but if you would like to, please use the PayFast link in the channel description. Thank you so much, and I will see you on the next video.